A single dad kneels in the snow to fix a stranded CEO's car on a mountain road outside a small Vermont town, refuses her money, and drives off without another word. She sits behind the wheel long after his taillights disappear into the storm, staring at nothing, because something about his voice just cracked her wide open. 9 years ago, she loved a boy who vanished without saying goodbye, and she is almost certain, almost terrified, that she just found him again. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay close, because this one earns every minute of your time. I'm one of those people who thinks winter gets an unfair reputation. Everybody talks about the cold like it's only an ending, like the world just shuts its eyes and waits for spring. But I've always thought snow was more honest than that. It covers the mess, sure, but it also shows you every footprint that matters, every path somebody chose to walk toward you. That's the story I want to tell you tonight. So settle in, and let's begin. Natalie Ford had given the closing remarks at a boardroom of 19 investors that morning, and by nightfall, she couldn't get a 9-year-old Volvo to turn over on a dead mountain road 40 minutes outside Harlow Creek, Vermont. The snow had started as a suggestion around noon and turned into a genuine argument by 6. Fat flakes swallowing the guardrails, swallowing the yellow line down the center of the road, swallowing every landmark she might have used to guess how far she was from anywhere at all. She tried the key again. Nothing answered her but a single dry click, small and final, like a door somewhere deciding to lock itself. Her phone showed 1 bar of signal, then none, then 1 again, teasing her the way bad news always did. She pressed her forehead against the wheel and laughed once, without any humor in it, because 6 hours ago she had been the most powerful person in a room full of powerful people, and now she couldn't do a single thing to make an old car listen to her. That was when she saw the headlights coming up slow behind her, cutting twin cones through the snow. A pickup truck, work-dented, salt-stained along the wheel wells, eased onto the shoulder behind her hazards. The door groaned open and a man climbed out, tall enough that the wind seemed to notice him, broad through the shoulders in a canvas jacket that had clearly seen a decade of Vermont winters. He walked up without hurrying, snow catching in dark hair that was just beginning to gray at the temples, and crouched near her window. "Car trouble," he said, more statement than question, his breath fogging white in the cold. Natalie rolled the window down 2 inches, just enough to answer him, feeling suddenly and strangely exposed in her tailored coat and her city boots that weren't built for anything but sidewalks. "It won't start," she admitted. "I don't even know what's wrong with it. I just want to get home before this gets any worse." He nodded toward the hood. "Mind if I take a look? Might be something simple." She popped the hood before she'd fully decided to trust him, some old instinct recognizing the calm, unhurried way he moved, like a man who had never once needed to prove anything to anyone. He leaned into the engine with a flashlight clipped to his collar, murmuring to himself, checking wires with bare fingers that had to be freezing. "Battery terminals corroded half to death," he said finally, straightening up. "Give me 2 minutes." He went back to his truck and returned with a small wire brush and a rag, working the corrosion off the terminal with the patient concentration of a man who had done this 1,000 times and never once resented doing it 1,001. Natalie watched him through the windshield, snow gathering on his shoulders, and felt an old door somewhere inside her creak open half an inch, in a hallway she thought she'd locked years ago. "Try it now," he said, and she turned the key, and the engine caught on the first try, rough and grateful and alive. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, and meant it more than the words could hold. She stepped out into the cold anyway, because it felt wrong to thank a stranger through 2 inches of window glass. "I have to pay you for this," she said, already reaching for her bag. "Please, just tell me what I owe you." He shook his head, wiping grease from his hands onto the rag. "It was a corroded terminal, not a transplant," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made the joke land soft instead of dismissive. "Nothing to pay for. Get home safe. That's payment enough for me." She started to argue and then stopped, because something about the shape of his smile in the streetlight, something about the unhurried kindness of him, had just knocked the wind clean out of her. "I'm Natalie," she said instead, holding out a hand that trembled slightly from more than just the cold. He took it, his palm rough and warm despite the weather. "Miles," he said. "Miles Sutton." Natalie repeated the name twice in her head, searching for a memory that refused to surface all the way, like a word sitting just behind her teeth. "You live around here?" she asked, mostly to keep him talking, mostly because some part of her wasn't ready for him to disappear into the snow yet. "Run the auto shop in town," he said, tilting his head toward the faint glow of Harlow Creek below the ridge. 20 minutes down the mountain. He glanced at her car, at her coat, at the leather bag on the passenger seat that probably cost more than his truck. "Long way from home yourself, looks like." She managed a small laugh. "You have no idea," she said, and he smiled again. And that smile did something to her chest that felt dangerously close to recognition. He closed her hood, told her to drive careful on the ice past mile marker 9, and walked back to his truck without asking for anything else. Not her number, not her last name, nothing. She watched his taillights shrink into red smudges in the storm and then vanish around the curve entirely. And she sat there in the running car for a long, strange minute, her heart doing something it hadn't done in years. It was the eyes that finally did it. She would think later, replaying it on the drive home. Gray-blue, steady, the kind of eyes that looked at you like you were a person and not a name on a business card. She had seen those eyes before, 9 years before, on a library staircase in a different life, when she was 20 and scared, and a boy she barely knew had stepped between her and 3 drunk strangers without a single moment of hesitation. His name back then had been Miles too. Of course it had. Natalie gripped the wheel so hard her knuckles went white, snow ticking softly against the windshield, and understood with a lurch that made her stomach drop that she had just spent 6 minutes talking to the first boy she had ever loved, and he had looked straight through her like she was any other stranded stranger on any other cold Vermont road. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the enormous, empty quiet of her penthouse and stared at the ceiling, running the whole encounter back frame by frame, his voice, his hands, the particular tilt of his head when he'd asked if she needed help. 9 years ago, they had talked until sunrise on a dorm room floor about everything and nothing, and then he had simply stopped answering his phone and eventually stopped existing in her world at all. She had told herself for years that it hadn't meant what it felt like it meant, that 20-year-olds fall in love with anyone who's kind to them at the right moment, that it was nostalgia dressed up as heartbreak. But lying there at 3 in the morning with snow ticking against her window, she knew that wasn't true and had never been true, not for one single day of the 9 years since. At 3:15, she gave up and reached for her laptop instead of her pride. Sutton Auto Repair, Harlow Creek, Vermont, came up in the first search, a modest website with a handful of photos. And there he was, arms crossed, leaning against a garage bay door, the same unhurried half-smile. Below the shop's hours was a single line that made her breath catch. Family-owned, serving Harlow Creek since Miles and his daughter moved home 9 years ago. A daughter. She scrolled until she found a school fundraiser photo, a little girl with a gap-toothed grin and a cloud of dark curls, holding Miles's hand outside a bake sale table, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. There was no mother in any picture, no wedding ring in any close-up of his hands. Natalie sat with that for a long time, feeling something complicated settle low in her chest, equal parts relief and grief for time that could never be gotten back. She told herself the next morning that she was only driving up to Harlow Creek to properly thank him, that a stranded stranger owed a debt and she intended to pay it. She told herself that the whole 40 minutes up the mountain, past the mile marker where the guardrail still wore a faint dusting of yesterday's snow, until she parked across the street from a squat brick building with Sutton Auto painted in fading letters above the bay doors. Through the window, she could see him bent over an engine, sleeves pushed up despite the cold, and for one long moment, she almost put the car back in drive and fled down the mountain the way she had come. Then he glanced up, saw her, and lifted a hand in an easy wave before she'd even decided whether to get out, and there was no graceful way to leave after that. The shop smelled like motor oil and coffee. A heavy-set older man behind the counter, Ray Bellamy according to the name stitched on his coveralls, looked up and called out that Miles had a customer, and Miles came around the corner wiping his hands on a rag, surprise, and something warmer flickering across his face when he recognized her. "Everything all right with the car?" he asked. "Perfect," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you properly this time." She held up the paper bag from the bakery 2 doors down. feeling suddenly and thoroughly foolish, like a teenager showing up somewhere she hadn't been invited. "If you have a minute," she added, and he glanced back at Ray, who waved him off with a knowing look that Natalie pretended not to notice. They ended up on a bench outside, breath clouding between them, sandwiches going slightly cold in the wind. "You didn't have to drive an hour for this," Miles said, unwrapping his half. "I wanted to," she said, and meant it more than the sentence let on. They talked for a while about nothing: the shop, the town, the way the mountain held on to winter longer than the valley did. And then Miles went quiet for a second too long, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he suspects he's seen the shape of before. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "I looked you up last night. Natalie Ford, CEO of Winslow Dynamics. That's not exactly a small operation you're running." His voice wasn't accusing, just careful. People who run companies like that don't usually drive up a mountain for a sandwich with a mechanic. "So what is this really about?" Natalie felt her pulse jump, felt 9 years of buried words rising up her throat all at once. "Westfield University," she said quietly. "Introduction to Structural Engineering, junior year. You sat 2 rows behind me and always smelled like coffee and cold air." Miles went very still, the sandwich forgotten in his hand, his eyes searching her face like a man trying to see through fog. "There was a night in October," she went on, my voice shaking now despite every effort to keep it steady. "Outside the library, some guys wouldn't leave me alone, and a boy I barely knew stepped in without even blinking." "That was you, Miles," she said. "That was me. You walked home. We talked until the sun came up about everything, and then you just disappeared, and I never stopped wondering what happened to you." Miles set the sandwich down very carefully on the bench between them, like he needed both hands free for whatever was happening in his chest. "Natalie," he said slowly, testing the name like it belonged to someone else entirely. "You had different hair. You were smaller. I was 20 and living on ramen and a scholarship I was terrified of losing," she said, half laughing, half something closer to tears. "I looked for you afterward. I asked around campus for weeks. Nobody knew where you'd gone. My mother got sick that spring," Miles said, the words coming slower now, dragged up from somewhere he clearly didn't visit often. "Cancer, and bad enough that I had to come home to take care of her, and there wasn't money left over for anything, including finishing school. I tried calling the dorm number you gave me, and it just rang and rang," he continued, "and after a while I told myself it was for the best, that a girl like you didn't need to watch me lose everything I had." Natalie felt an old ache loosen its grip, tender and finally given room to breathe. "You could have told me," she said softly. "I would have waited. I would have found a way." "I didn't think there was a way worth finding," Miles admitted, and for the first time she saw exactly how much that year had cost him. They sat with that for a while, the wind pulling at the edges of the paper bag between them, neither of them quite ready to be the one who moved first. "I should get back," Miles said eventually, standing and offering her a hand up that lingered half a second longer than it needed to. "This is Chloe's pickup day," he added, his voice going soft and unguarded in a way it hadn't for the rest of the conversation. Over the next 2 weeks, Natalie found reasons to be in Harlow Creek that grew steadily less convincing to anyone paying attention, including herself. A supplier meeting that could have happened by video call. An errand that didn't need running in person. Each time she found her way to the bench outside Sutton Auto, and each time Miles seemed to already be watching the street when she pulled up, like some part of him had been listening for her car. She met Chloe on the 3rd visit, a small tornado of curls and questions who informed Natalie within 30 seconds that dinosaurs did not actually go extinct because of an asteroid. That was only part of the story, and demanded to know if Natalie had ever seen snow fall so hard you couldn't see your own hand. Natalie said she hadn't. Not really. Not since she was young enough to still believe snow was magic instead of just weather. Chloe's mother had left for good when Chloe was barely 2, a fact Miles mentioned once, quietly, without asking for sympathy, and Natalie understood then why the little girl guarded her father so fiercely, and why his hands went so careful and slow whenever he reached for something he actually wanted to keep. "It's magic if you decide it's magic," Chloe informed her solemnly, and Miles caught Natalie's eye over his daughter's head with an expression that looked hopelessly fond, and Natalie felt the last of her careful boardroom composure melt clean off her like frost off a windshield in the sun. That night, driving back down the mountain, She realized she hadn't thought about Winslow dynamics in nearly 6 hours and hadn't missed thinking about it even once. The following weekend, Miles invited her to dinner at the house instead of the bench outside the shop, a small clapboard place at the edge of town with a crooked porch light and a pile of firewood stacked higher than Chloe's head. They ate spaghetti at a table covered in Chloe's dinosaur drawings, and afterward, with the dishes still soaking, Chloe declared it was officially cold enough for a snowball fight and refused to accept any argument to the contrary. Natalie, in a coat entirely unsuited for combat, took a snowball directly to the shoulder and retaliated so enthusiastically that Miles ended up laughing too hard to properly defend himself. And by the time they all collapsed breathless on the porch steps, snow melting into her collar, Natalie understood that this small, loud, unglamorous life was the first thing in 9 years that had felt entirely, uncomplicatedly like happiness. But something was holding Miles back, some wall she could feel even when his hands were warm around a coffee cup across the table from her, some flinch every time she mentioned the future out loud. It came to a head on a Friday evening in late January, snow falling steady and silent outside the shop windows as Miles pulled the bay door down for the night and found Natalie waiting by her car, still in her work coat, having driven up straight from the office. "I wasn't expecting you tonight," he said, and his smile didn't quite make it all the way to his eyes. "I wanted to see you," she said. "Is that all right?" "Of course," he said, though his shoulders had gone tight and careful. "Natalie, what are we doing here?" he asked finally, the words coming out rough, like they'd been sitting behind his teeth for days waiting for an opening. "What do you mean?" she asked, though some cold, small part of her already knew. "I mean this," Miles said, gesturing between them, the space where two very different lives were trying to overlap. "You run a company with offices on 3 continents. I fix transmissions and go home to help an 8-year-old with her spelling homework. I don't see how the math on that works out, Natalie, no matter how good the last 2 weeks have felt. I'm not asking you to solve any math," she said, her voice rising despite herself. "You should be," Miles said, dragging a hand through his hair, snow catching in it from the open door behind him. 9 years ago, I was the guy who had to drop out and disappear, and now I'm still here. Same small shop, same small town, and you're standing in rooms with 19 investors closing deals worth more than this whole block. What exactly do you think happens to us in 6 months when the mountain stops feeling romantic and starts just feeling like a long drive? Is that really what you think this is?" Natalie asked, stepping closer despite every instinct telling her to protect herself instead. "That I've been driving an hour each way for 2 weeks because I'm bored, because slumming it up a mountain with a mechanic is some kind of novelty for me? I don't know what to think anymore," Miles said, and the honesty of it hurt worse than any lie could have. "Then let me make it simple for you," she said, snow gathering unnoticed on her shoulders now. 9 years ago, you made me feel like a person instead of a scholarship kid nobody would miss if she disappeared. And then you vanished, and I built an entire life trying to prove I mattered to a world that only ever cared what I could do for it. I have closed 9-figure deals in boardrooms full of men twice my age and felt absolutely nothing afterward, nothing at all. And then you fixed a battery terminal in the snow, and I felt more alive in 10 minutes than I had in years." Miles didn't answer right away, his jaw working, his eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm scared," he admitted finally, quiet and rough. "I'm scared of being the thing that drags you backward. I'm scared Chloe gets attached, and then you realize what you gave up to be here." Natalie stepped close enough to take his hand, cold fingers wrapping around cold fingers, snow settling soft and silent between them like the world had decided to hold its breath. "I've regretted plenty of things," she said softly. "You have never once been on that list, not for a single day in 9 years." He seemed to finally give way, some last board coming loose from a door he'd nailed shut a long time ago. He kissed her there in the falling snow outside the shop, careful at first, and then not careful at all, 9 years of unfinished sentences pouring into a single unhurried moment neither of them wanted to rush through. If only the story could have simply ended there, warm and easy, the way the best ones sometimes do. But 2 towns over, in a glass office that never seemed to get cold no matter the season, a man named Damon Ashworth was looking at a photograph on his phone with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just found the one loose thread he needed. Damon sat on Winslow Dynamics' board, had sat on it for 11 years, and had wanted Natalie's chair for nearly as long. He had been quietly buying up struggling storefront leases across 3 counties for the better part of a year through a shell company called Cedar Point Holdings, positioning himself for a resort development deal that would make him more money than the board seat ever could, if only the right pieces fell into place at the right time. Sutton Auto's building happened to sit on a corner lot Cedar Point needed badly, and Damon had been patiently waiting for leverage. Damon had been passed over for the CEO position the same year Natalie took it, a decision the board had made unanimously and which Damon had never once accepted with any real grace. Smiling through 11 years of meetings while quietly deciding the company owed him a debt it hadn't agreed to. He told himself the resort scheme was simply good business, separate from all of that. But the truth, buried somewhere he didn't examine too closely, was that hurting Natalie had always felt like a bonus he wouldn't mind collecting. The photograph on his phone showed Natalie Ford, CEO of a publicly traded company, kissing a small-town mechanic in the snow outside a garage, and Damon smiled the thin, satisfied smile of a man who has just discovered he can solve 2 problems with a single well-placed phone call. He forwarded the photo to 3 other board members with a short note about reputational risk and questionable judgment, and then he made a second call to a man who handled Cedar Point's less official business. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday morning, the room colder than the weather outside despite the radiators clanking away in the corners. Damon stood without waiting to be introduced, opened a presentation with the photograph already loaded on the screen, and let the silence do some of his work for him before he even spoke. We're here to discuss how far this board is willing to let personal judgment compromise the integrity of this company, he said. Judith Holloway, the longest-serving member of the board and the only one who had ever openly disagreed with Damon in 11 years, folded her hands and studied the photograph without flinching. "That's a kiss in the snow, Damon, not a felony," she said dryly. "I'd like to understand what exactly we're litigating here." Natalie stood before Damon could answer for her, her voice steady even though her hands were not quite steady at her sides. "I'm not going to pretend that photograph isn't real," she said, "because pretending has never once solved anything in my life. What I will say is that under my leadership this company posted its strongest 2 quarters in company history, and none of that happened despite my personal life. It happened because I finally have something worth going home for besides another quarter's numbers." "Sentiment is not a strategy," Damon said coolly. "And relationships with unvetted outside parties create exposure this board has a fiduciary duty to address." Natalie felt her pulse hammering but kept her voice level. "Say what you actually mean, Damon," she said. "You've wanted my chair since before I sat in it, and you found a photograph you thought would finally hand it to you. This has nothing to do with fiduciary duty and everything to do with opportunity." One of the younger board members, a quiet man who rarely spoke in these meetings, cleared his throat and admitted he'd voted with Damon on instinct alone, without ever asking himself why a photograph of 2 consenting adults should matter to quarterly earnings at all, and that the discomfort in the room said more about their own assumptions than about Natalie's judgment. His honesty seemed to loosen the whole room at once, a few shoulders dropping, a few uncertain glances turning thoughtful instead of defensive. The room held its breath for a long moment before Judith spoke again, quiet but absolutely certain. "I've watched this company for 2 decades, she said, "and I have never once seen this board rattled by a man's personal life the way you're all rattling now over a woman's. Perhaps we ask ourselves honestly what standard we're actually applying here, and to whom." The vote, when it finally came, went against Damon 11-4, and for one bright, unguarded morning it felt like the whole storm had simply passed them by. It hadn't. 3 days later, Miles opened Sutton Auto to find a certified letter waiting under the door, terminating his lease effective in 30 days, the building's ownership having quietly changed hands to Cedar Point Holdings the previous month without a single public announcement. Ray found him standing in the empty bay an hour later, still holding the letter, staring at the space where his father's old tools still hung along the back wall. 30 days, Miles said, when Ray finally asked what was wrong, his voice flat in the particular way of a man trying very hard not to feel something all the way through yet. 30 days to find a new location, new financing, new everything, or Chloe and I are both out of a livelihood in the dead of winter. Ray, who had worked beside Miles's father for 20 years before Miles took over the shop, put a heavy hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything for a long moment. Because some things don't have easy words. You built something real here, Ray said finally, gruff around the edges the way he got whenever something actually mattered to him. Your dad would be sitting right there on that stool telling you the same thing I'm about to. Whatever happens with this building, it doesn't undo 9 years of every person in this town trusting you with their cars and half their secrets besides. That matters more than a lease, son. Even on the day it doesn't feel like it does. Ray had worked those same bays since Miles was in diapers, had stood at the funeral when Miles's father passed, and quietly kept the shop running for 6 months afterward without ever once mentioning it. Because that was simply what a person did for family, blood, or otherwise. When your dad hired me, I had nothing, Ray said, voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. No truck, no tools, a wife in the hospital, and no way to pay for it. He never once made me feel small for needing help. Buildings come and go, Miles. What your father built doesn't live in the walls. Miles called Natalie that night and told her everything in a voice stripped almost entirely of its usual warmth, and a cold, sharp recognition ran straight through her even before he finished the sentence. Because Cedar Point Holdings was a name she had seen exactly once before, buried 3 layers deep in a due diligence file Damon had conveniently never mentioned owning any stake in. This isn't a coincidence, she said quietly. This is Damon, and this is my fault. It's not your fault, Miles said, but there was a new distance in his voice that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, careful and guarded in a way that made Natalie's stomach drop. Miles, she started, but he cut her off gently. I need some time, Natalie, he said. Not because of you, not because of anything you did wrong. I just need to figure out how to protect my daughter's home without it costing me the last of what my father built, and I can't do that clearly with my head full of you right now. She didn't argue with him that night, though everything in her wanted to. She drove home through snow that had turned heavier and meaner than any storm that winter, and sat alone in her penthouse realizing that 9 years of building an empire out of spite and ambition might amount to nothing if none of it could protect the one thing that had finally made her feel like herself again. Chloe noticed before either adult expected her to. She found her father sitting at the kitchen table 2 nights later, papers spread in front of him that he wasn't really reading, and climbed into the chair across from him with the particular seriousness only an 8-year-old can summon. Are we losing the shop? She asked, no preamble at all, and Miles's first instinct was to lie, and his second, better instinct was to remember his own father never once lying to him about hard things. We might have to move it, he said carefully, or find a new one. It's complicated, sweetheart. Chloe considered this with the gravity of a much older person. Is it because of Natalie? She asked, and Miles felt his chest cave in a little at the question. No, he said firmly. This isn't Natalie's fault. Chloe studied him a moment longer. She makes you laugh different than you used to, she said. I like that. I don't want you to stop just because grown-ups are being mean about a building. Miles didn't have an answer for that right away, and Chloe, apparently satisfied she'd made her point as thoroughly as an 8-year-old could, slid off the chair and went to find her colored pencils instead, leaving her father alone with the quiet, devastating clarity of a child who somehow already understood what he'd been too scared to admit to himself. That night he lay awake a long time listening to the wind, thinking about doors that get nailed shut and the cost of finally opening them. Natalie, meanwhile, had spent 3 sleepless nights combing through the due diligence file that had suddenly stopped feeling like routine paperwork and started feeling like a weapon. Cedar Point Holdings traced back through 2 shell layers to an account Damon had opened the same month he'd been passed over for the CEO position she now held, and the timeline of storefront acquisitions across 3 counties matched almost exactly with a resort proposal Damon had quietly shopped to a private equity group 6 months earlier. She brought everything to Judith Holloway on a Tuesday morning, laying it out across the older woman's desk, watching Judith's expression shift from careful neutrality to something sharper as the pieces assembled themselves into a picture neither of them liked. This isn't just about my personal life anymore, Natalie said. He used this board's resources and his fiduciary position to build a private real estate scheme, and he's using it now to punish people who have nothing to do with any of it. Judith studied the file for a long time before she spoke. Bring this to the full board Thursday, she said finally. Not as a defense of your relationship, Natalie, as evidence of a director who has spent a year quietly working against the exact company he's supposed to be protecting. And bring the mechanic's lease agreement too, she added, almost gently. Sometimes the clearest way to show a man's true character is to show exactly who he's willing to hurt to get what he wants. Thursday's meeting was colder than Monday's had been, snow falling thick and steady past the wide conference windows. While Natalie laid out 11 months of shell company transactions on the screen, Damon's face going progressively more rigid with every new document that appeared. "This is a fabrication," he said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness entirely. "This is a coordinated attack on my character because I raised a legitimate governance concern." The concern was legitimate, Judith said evenly, which is exactly why we voted on it fairly and moved on. What isn't legitimate is a board member running a private acquisition scheme through this company's competitive footprint and then weaponizing a stranded motorist's kindness to cover his own tracks. The vote to remove Damon from the board took 11 minutes and passed unanimously, including, to Damon's visible fury, the 4 members who had originally sided with him 3 days earlier. It didn't undo the certified letter sitting on Miles's kitchen table, though, not immediately, not on its own, and Natalie knew it wouldn't be enough on its own the moment she watched Damon storm out of the boardroom, still insisting none of it would matter in the end. She drove up the mountain that same afternoon, snow falling soft and steady the whole way, rehearsing what she wanted to say and abandoning every version of it before she'd even parked the car. Miles was closing the bay door when she pulled up, and for a moment neither of them moved, snow settling quiet between them the way it had the night everything had first cracked open weeks earlier. "I got him removed from the board," Natalie said finally, because it felt more honest than any softer opening line she could have chosen. "It doesn't fix your lease. I know it doesn't fix your lease. I just needed you to know the truth came out, whatever happens next." Miles was quiet for a long moment, snow gathering slowly on his shoulders, on the collar of his jacket, on the dark hair that had gone gray at the temples the same year his whole life had rearranged itself once already. "I've been thinking a lot the last few days," he said finally. "About my dad, actually. He used to say a building's just a building. It's the hands inside it that make it worth something. I think I forgot that for a minute, being scared. I'm sorry I pulled away," he continued, "and I'm sorry it took almost losing everything to remember that being scared isn't the same thing as being right." Natalie felt the knot behind her ribs finally give way after days of holding itself painfully tight. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "Not because of a building, not because of a board seat, not because of anything except the fact that you make me feel like a person instead of a name on a stock ticker, and I am done pretending that's not worth fighting for." They stood there a long moment in the falling snow before Miles finally closed the distance between them, and this kiss was different from the one weeks earlier, steadier. Sure, the kind of kiss two people share when they've already survived the part where everything could have fallen apart and chosen each other anyway. Behind them, Ray watched through the window with the deeply satisfied expression of a man who had known exactly how this would end all along. The lease termination, it turned out, had a hole in it, though it took Natalie 3 phone calls and a Saturday spent on her own legal team's speakerphone to find it, refusing to accept the first answer that came back clean but insufficient. "Dig deeper," she told them. "Damon doesn't leave paperwork sloppy by accident," which is exactly how they found the improperly filed ownership transfer, a filing error Cedar Point's own Rush lawyers had made while racing to close before anyone noticed. It voided Cedar Point's claim entirely and returned the deed to its original owner, an elderly widow who, once informed of the whole situation, was more than happy to renew Miles's lease at the exact rate his father had paid 15 years earlier, plus a note that simply read, "Your father fixed my truck for free the winter I lost my husband. Consider this even." Spring came slow to the mountain that year, the way it always did, snow lingering stubborn in the shaded corners of Harlow Creek, well past the point everyone in town had stopped expecting it. Natalie kept her office in the city but built her calendar around Fridays on the mountain, and somewhere in that slow unfolding season, she stopped thinking of Harlow Creek as somewhere she visited and started thinking of it as somewhere she was, quietly and completely, coming home. She stood in the bleachers one Saturday in early spring watching Chloe attempt to play soccer with the focused enthusiasm of a girl far more interested in the mud along the sideline than the actual ball, Miles's hand warm and certain in hers the whole game through. Last week she asked if you were going to be her stepmom someday. Miles said quietly, watching his daughter chase a dandelion instead of the play developing 20 feet away. What did you tell her? Natalie asked, her heart doing something complicated and warm in her chest. I told her that was between the two of you to figure out together, Miles said, and then, quieter, but for what it's worth, I'd like that. Someday, when you're ready, not before. Someday soon, Natalie said softly, and meant every word of it completely, watching snow-fed streams still running high and fast along the edge of the field under a sky finally, gently turning blue. Ray had come to watch the game too, parked in a folding chair at the end of the bleachers with a thermos of coffee, and when Chloe scored her accidental goal, he cheered louder than anyone else on the sideline. Loud enough that Miles turned around laughing and told him he was going to scare off the other team's parents. Ray just grinned and said some things were worth being loud about, and Natalie, watching the two of them, understood that whatever family meant, it had never required matching last names to count. That winter had tried to take everything from both of them, a job, a home, a business built across 2 generations, and had instead given them back to each other twice. Once on a dark mountain road, and once again in a boardroom neither of them had expected honesty to survive. Sometimes, Natalie thought, watching Miles lift his laughing daughter onto his shoulders after the game, the coldest season of the year turns out to be the one that finally thaws something you'd stopped believing could ever warm again. If this story found its way into your heart tonight, tell us below what part stayed with you longest. We read every single comment. And if Winter Veil has earned a place in your world, hit subscribe and stay close, because there's always another story waiting just past the next storm.